Take a little trip with me, I'm gonna take you home.
Take a little history down this lane of memories.
Down this lane.
So let's raise another glass for the glorious past and the friends we have become. Yeah, 'cause little did we know the good times come and go, but the best is yet to come.
Hello and welcome to a very special interview for The Wire. This morning, the Prime Minister extended the lockdown to the 3rd of May with increased severity during the first week, but the possibility of some relaxation thereafter. My guest today is one of India's top epidemiologists, and he firmly believes that a lockdown is not the right or best way of tackling the coronavirus. He believes there is another method which is far more efficacious. With me to talk about his thinking and to explain it in detail is the former principal of the Christian Medical College in Vellore and the chairman of the Scientific Advisory Committee of the National Institute of Epidemiology, Dr. Jayaprakash Muliyil. Dr. Muliyil, let me start by exploring your thinking. You believe that a lockdown is not the right way of tackling the coronavirus. All it does is delay the outbreak of large infections, but whenever the lockdown is removed, those infections will occur. Can you start by explaining why you believe this?
Well, lockdown for India is the one I was afraid of. I was just voicing my concern for the poorer sections of the community. Now, I'm not saying lockdown should never be used. New Zealand used it efficiently, but they could afford it. They were given 3 days notice and they all went into a lockdown. But that was in the early stage of containment of the disease, and they seem to be winning. But for us, the problem is lockdown is, like you said, not a solution for the problem of coronavirus. It does, however, achieve another important goal of slowing down the virus. But the cost is very high, so you got to use it judiciously. And the longer you keep under lockout, more the suffering for the people.
I'll come to the cost in a moment's time, but first let me clarify what you're saying. You're saying what a lockdown does is to delay the outbreak of a large number of infections, but the virus doesn't disappear. So when the lockdown is lifted, the virus is present, and that same large number of infections can occur after the lockdown has been lifted. Have I understood correctly?
Absolutely. And
So
theoretically, if you keep the lockdown on for, say, more than a year or two, well, that'll be a disaster to the country. You probably could control all that long the disease. But that is not practical.
You're saying a very important thing, sir. You're saying that what a lockdown does is not confront the virus, it simply hides us from the virus. And you can continue hiding for a whole year till a vaccine is developed, but that would be a very, very unwise course of action.
You put it so very nicely. That is correct. And the problem comes up is that it actually was provoked by the anxiety of what corona could do on our people. If you leave it alone without any interference, it could get into a phase of inflationary growth. And the fear of that, in which case you will have a large number of cases simultaneously, and then suddenly you'll also have large number of deaths. And nobody wanted that to happen. So lockdown buys us time. not a solution, but buys us time to get ready.
But as you also said, it buys time at a terrible cost. We logically we have only two options. Either we carry on with the lockdown till such time as there is a virus, which means the lockdown has to continue for a year or more, and that is an impossibility to consider. The other is you have longish periodic lockdowns, but the problem is either way, hundreds of millions of people have lost their jobs, they're destitute, they're hungry, maybe starving. For them, the lockdown is not just endangering their livelihood, it's possibly endangering their lives as well.
I think that is, in a way, very correct. But the question we have to ask is, were you prepared at all for this particular kind of an epidemic where the mortality could be very high? And answer is no. So I think if I were sitting in the government, I would be very scared. The question is, if you use this period of time, in fact, lockdown did slow down the transmission of the disease, but we have to do something to prepare ourselves.
Well, that's
And
where I
also-
want to interrupt, sir. You have written about this in the Business Standard in the interview you gave. You said, in fact, there is another way of tackling coronavirus, not the lockdown, another way, and that is the lesson we've learned from the H1N1 epidemic of 2009. Can you explain at this point what is the lesson we learned from H1N1 in 2009?
Well, when H1N1 came in, we knew one little secret, that the H1N1 did not have a very high mortality. So that put us all, in a very confident position. What happened was, it came, it infected people, and suddenly, as if on a cue, it disappeared. It came down, and one fine morning, there was no more cases. It almost looked magical. The question everybody asked is, wow, what happened? Who controlled it? Nobody did. This is a characteristic of viral epidemic. They spread from person to person, accelerate themselves, and suddenly they reach a point in time they can't spread again. And this is because of the immunity that the community developed. We call it the herd immunity. And that particular wall prevents the transmission of disease anymore.
Now, let me interrupt at this point. Are you suggesting that just as herd immunity worked in 2009 with H1N1, it can work with the coronavirus as well? That is clearly what you were saying in the Business Standard article. But I'm asking you once again to confirm your position. Are you saying that today again?
Well, finally developing herd immunity is the only lasting solution. No other solution, because we don't have any drugs for this, we don't have any vaccine for it. So the only way we can do is our immunity protect ourselves. So you need to somehow move towards a herd immunity in a sensible fashion. But the problem is that kind of herd immunity, if you develop, you will have lots of deaths, unacceptable number of deaths. And that is the anxiety. How do you get herd immunity without having high mortality?
Well, you've sketched out a dilemma, and I want to put it back to you. You began by saying that developing herd immunity is the only solution to coronavirus. Lockdowns are not a solution. As you agreed, a lockdown does not confront the virus, it's simply a way of hiding from the virus. The herd immunity is the only solution. But the problem is, and the Director General of the World Health Organization said this clearly last night, coronavirus is 10 times more virulent than H1N1. So the number of deaths that will occur as you try and develop herd immunity for coronavirus will be unacceptably large. So the dilemma is, you call this the only solution, but this solution, by your own admission, requires an unacceptable number of deaths. So what sort of solution is it?
So that solution emerges from the performance of coronavirus so far. It appears to be an extremely mild disease in the younger population. It's a killer when you grow older. So in our population, there are younger population who can face it and be very little harmed. But the problem with the whole issue is that elderly are highly susceptible for serious outcome. If you look at the pattern of deaths in UK, 80% of the deaths occurred in those above, 80% of the dead people were aged 80 or more, so 60 or more. The proportion of people who died in the younger age group, I'm using a wrong English language there. The proportion of dead who are less than 60 was only 20%. Now, remember, the large proportion of the young produce small proportion of deaths, but the smaller proportion elderly gave rise to a large quantum of death.
So what you're saying then, sir, is that we can afford to try to build herd immunity amongst our younger population. And in India's case, 90% of the Indian population is under 60. It's only 10% that are over 60. If I understand you correctly, you're saying we can afford to try and build herd immunity using the 90% under 60 because their susceptibility to the virus is very different. Only a small number will fall ill, a very small number will sadly die, but they will be able to protect everyone because they will acquire herd immunity. Is that a correct understanding of your position?
It is a very correct understanding, except that there will be a few losses in the young too. And that losses can be reduced if they get access to treatment. The problem, remember, in a limited resource area like India, if a whole lot of people suddenly land up for healthcare, for acute illness, then nobody will get healthcare. If the young has to be protected, there should be adequate healthcare when in case they fall ill.
But is there adequate healthcare in India? I know the Prime Minister has announced 15,000 crore for protective equipment and other healthcare facilities. But that money has to be spent, equipment has to be acquired, maybe even the doctors have to be trained, ventilator specialists have to be trained. So when we attempt herd immunity with the 90% who are under 60, and as you say, some will fall ill, some will die, do we have the healthcare facilities to protect them? Or are you also saying by implication that is a sad, horrible sacrifice India will have to make if the population as a whole is going to survive?
And there lies the important point in this whole argument. We need to keep the elderly, the high-risk group, somehow out of the picture. Somehow you make sure, and we'll come to that later, but how do we do it is a different question. Imagine everybody over the 60 is somehow guarded against infection. The remaining 90% get the infection. Most of them will get subclinical infection. Some will get mild infection. a very, very small proportion serious illnesses.
In which case,
Of
Dr. Muliyil, is your advice to the Prime Minister? Now, we know he's already extended the lockdown till the 3rd of May, but he's also announced that after the first week of increased severity, after the 20th of April, there could be relaxations. Is your advice to him, please start relaxing it for the young, get them back to work, protect the elderly, and try and build herd immunity alongside ramping up health facilities to protect those young who fall in? Is that your advice to him?
I that is correct, and I'm sure he is also being given same advice. But my point was, in the absence of elderly falling ill, even a scarce resources may be sufficient with some amount of beefing up to support the needs of the people falling ill in the younger population. But if the elderly also are falling ill simultaneously, that would be impossible to look after.
One quick question. Your entire belief that herd immunity can provide a solution, whereas the lockdown cannot, hinges on the fact that the young will not fall ill in large numbers. Most of them will only be subclinically ill. Very few will require hospitalization. How confident are you of the ability of the young to be resilient and not fall seriously ill?
The main reason I'm talking about is from the experience of UK, China, and South Korea, and even in US, the young have been relatively safe. You have to calculate a particular parameter called ratio of more deaths divided by proportion infected. So when you look at that particular parameter, it's very clear a strong age dependence on mortality given corona infection. So that gives me the confidence. It has been replicated in different countries. Same pattern emerges.
Now, let me ask you this. At what level of infection does herd immunity become effective? Are we talking about 40%, 45%, 50, 60? What percent of the population needs to have been exposed and infected for herd immunity to become effective?
Well, I got to make an educated guess from what people have been talking about. It does depend a lot on a lot of parameters, but I would put my money on 60%. That is provided you will not only allow young people to get immunity, but you allow this to happen in a phased manner. In other words, you need to continue to prevent large gatherings, where the transmission can have crowding. So, people will live without high exposure. If you combine these two, expose the young, but protect them from extreme exposures, so that it is actually a kind of a very tight rope walking.
Okay. So you're saying at the same time as exposing the young, you must ensure that large gatherings are banned, which means movie halls remain shut, theaters remain shut, restaurants, I presume, remain shut, big malls remain shut. Any large gathering remains banned, but you allow the young to get back to work in the hope that they will quickly build up herd immunity. You think the ballpark figure, it's guesswork on your part, is 60%. At that point, our society as a whole should have built up safety and protection against coronavirus.
Absolutely. And at that point, we go back to our old ways. That is important.
One more question, because it's implicit. We've half hinted at it, but I want to make it explicit. We are saying to India's young that because of your age and your resilience, you can withstand coronavirus better than anyone else. The country needs you to go out and build herd immunity. But we're also saying we know some of you, hopefully a very small number, will fall ill, and an even smaller number sadly will die. That, in a sense, is the sacrifice we're asking of our young.
You should compare that scenario with what would have happened had we not separated the elderly from the whole process. Elderly would have been, everybody would have got infected, and elderly people will be occupying all the beds in the intensive care unit, and that means access to healthcare is less. So we have to keep the elderly out.
I take your point completely. I'll end this part by saying that our discussion reminds us of those World War I posters of Lord Kitchener pointing his finger saying, your country needs you. And in a very real sense, we're saying to our young, your country needs you, your resilience, but also your willingness to put yourself in some form of danger, hopefully not very big, is the only thing that can save India.
Good. And it should be voluntary. If somebody wants to hide, perfectly all right. But most Indians will move in.
It's not by force. You're keeping the option open, and silently you're hoping that a lot of people will take the risk. So to end our discussion in part one, Dr. Muliyil, let me ask you this. Do you think the Prime Minister made a mistake today extending the lockdown to the 3rd of May with increased severity for the first week? Should he instead have started the process of relaxation so that we can start building up herd immunity?
I believe that the Prime Minister has a very large team of experts who are advising them. Now, I'm sure that all these issues were considered. And these are not very complex ideas, and people are aware of it, and those advisors will do it. The point is that how do you control a whole population, and their behavior? And the anxiety is that, will they fall in line? There's a convenience in lockdown because you can control people. The ideal way should be where people on their own take care of them. The balance in terms of how do we do it is a question that the government must be anxious about.
But it sounds to me, sir, as if you're suggesting that it was a very difficult choice, but by extending the lockdown, the Prime Minister may have taken the easier option. Releasing people slowly and asking them to observe self-control is more difficult. Enforcing a lockdown is easier.
Yeah, I suppose so. But the issue is this. I think he's fully aware, or his advisors must be fully aware. Every extra day on lockdown is going to increase the hardship of a section of the community. And they don't even understand what corona means.
Absolutely.
So that is a dilemma. So I hope there will be enough of public education and support, and also the relief measures that he has offered, and the gradual tapering will be well planned.
All right, we're going to take a break at that point, Dr. Muliyil. I want to come back and put you bluntly the issues and concerns that lie inherent in the herd immunity approach. We have touched upon them in part one, but I want to now put them directly to you because I'd like to get your response. Let's take a break at that point, Dr. Muliyil. When I come back, I want to put to you all the issues and concerns that lie inherent in herd immunity. They've all cropped up in our discussion so far, but I want to put them now much more bluntly and forcefully to see how you respond. But first, a message from our sponsor, then Live It, whilst we take a little break.
Take a little trip with me, I'm gonna take you home.
Take a little history
Take a little
down this lane of memories.
down this lane.
So let's raise another glass for the glorious past and the friends we have become. Yeah, yeah, 'cause little did we know the good times come and go, but the best is yet to come.
Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. My guest today is one of India's leading epidemiologists, the former principal of the Christian Medical College in Vellore, and the chairman of the Scientific Advisory Committee of the National Institute of Epidemiology, Dr. Jayaprakash Muliyil. Dr. Muliyil believes that a lockdown is neither the best nor the right way of tackling the coronavirus. In part one, he explained why, and in part one, he also said the only lasting solution, and those were his words, is building up herd immunity. And that means allowing India's 90% population who are under 60 to go out, to build up the immunity, probably to around 60% levels, and that will keep everyone safe. Now, in part two, I want to put to Dr. Muliyil the concerns and issues that are inherent in that herd immunity approach. Dr. Muliyil, the first problem is that we in India live in joint families. The young live with their elderly. When the young go out to work and they come back in the evening, they could end up infecting their parents and grandparents. So, how do you protect the elderly when we all live together in joint families?
Two ways to look at it. Number one, this cannot be legislated. It should come from within the family and by the individual. Elderly should know how to protect them, and that information should be clearly transmitted. There is no way you can police this. It has to be done by them. Now, number two, I know, for example, this particular move may not be perfect. Everybody cannot follow this. But even if there is a 50% compliance to this in the country, there will be a 50% reduction, at least, not 50, but at least 40% reduction in the mortality. So the difference is how compliant the population will be.
But can I put this to you? You're relying on people, A, being compliant themselves. As you say, it can't be legislated for, it can't be enforced by the police. You're relying, therefore, on people being aware and on communication. But in rural villages and in urban slums, families live in single one-room accommodation. How on earth do the elderly isolate from the young in one room?
Now let us look at this way. The well-to-do will have no problem for self-isolating. The middle class also will have the facilities to do it. But when it comes to the lower groups, we have problem. You don't have to be a slumdog, the poor in the city, wherever. And there is a difficulty. Now, a question we have to ask is what percentage of the elderly live in the slum? Of the total elderly, remember that age-specific mortality has always been favoring the well-to-do. They tend to live longer. But my point is that just because you can't get everybody to follow this is not the best solution. We have to try our best to have maximum compliance. I think recently somebody else mentioned, I in an interview suggested that in a rural area, the elderly person can also sleep under a mango tree. All I am saying is we have to be resourceful enough to think of out of the box and see how we can be protected. It's complicated.
Let me pick up on the two essential points you've made. You've said in rural India, the elderly can isolate from the young by sleeping in the open under, as you put it, a mango tree. And in slums, you said, the percentage of people who are elderly is actually quite small. It's the well-off who live longer. The poor tend to die at an earlier age. Therefore, there will be a very small percentage of people in slums who are in that age group over 60 where they are threatened. But unfortunately, even if you're true, and I'm not denying the fact you may be right, that age group over 60 living in slums will be highly endangered, won't they?
Yes. The slum is a mystery to all public health people. It's so difficult to control everything. The sheer density of population is overwhelming. And these are the realities we have to accept.
Quite right.
Sorry?
These are the realities of India, which may be hurtful and painful, but we have to accept them. One more critical issue to do with herd immunity. India's young, compared to the young in the West, are malnourished, and as a result of their physical weakness, they are more prone to infection and disease. Doesn't that mean that in the process of building up herd immunity, many more Indian young will be vulnerable compared to European and American young? It's not the same. Our young may not be, and probably will not be, as resilient as the young in the West.
Yeah, that sounds nice when you say this, but the reality is not that. The immunity against this infection is one of the fundamental part of our body chemistry. And you have to be extremely malnourished for that to be effective.
So
I remember I used to work with
poverty does not impact on the resilience of the young.
Yes, right. They are very immunocompetent. They will fight it back. I have no doubt about it.
Let me put this to you. In the early days, long before he fell ill himself, Boris Johnson had attempted for some 24, 36 hours to follow the path of herd immunity. One of his famous statements was to tell the country, we have to take it on the chin. Very quickly, Britain changed course. You're still recommending herd immunity despite the British experience. People will wonder why.
Well, Boris Johnson underestimates the size of the chin you need to take the blow. The point is that they did not probably anticipate the number of people who suddenly land up seeking acute care. And it is not socially acceptable. The calculated number of deaths expected was known to the experts. But then they realized it is not socially acceptable to present it all in a short period of time. This would have happened in 3 or 4 months, so many deaths. So they're still pursuing.
Are you saying, Dr. Muliyil, that a large number of deaths in Britain are not socially acceptable to the British, but a large number of deaths in India are socially acceptable to the Indian? Is that what you're saying? Or are you saying that because of the age profile of the Indian population, 90% being below 60, we won't have that same mortality rate?
No, I was not answering that. I was wondering why Britain seemed to have changed their mind. I would like you to know they have not moved away from the concept of herd immunity. But what they realized is, if you try to get there too fast, that will be very, very socially upsetting. The society can't take it. So you have to spread it out. The point is they didn't separate the elderly from the rest. What I am suggesting is that our country is so large and the expected deaths are so large, we need to try and reduce this mortality by making sure a large proportion elderly never comes into contact with coronavirus through the herd immunity of the young. If that is the case, we actually, completely avoid this high mortality issue. Imagine.
Again, forgive me interrupting, Dr. Muliyil, but there's a dilemma inherent here. Our strength as a country, or our resilience as a country, emerges from the fact that 90% of us are under the age of 60, and therefore we're resilient. We will not suffer the disease so badly. Only a very small number will die. We can use this to build up herd immunity. But the dilemma is that our 10% that are over 60, A, live along with the young, B, it's very difficult to separate them. I know you said that the upper class and the upper middle class can separate, but there are 400 million Indians in the lower class at least who cannot separate young from old. And that percentage of young will be endangered. That's the dilemma. This is both the solution, but it also is a big, big risk.
The issue you should remember is we don't have alternative. We have to ask the question, given these restrictions, given that we can't have a lockdown for a long time, given that there are some of the places where you cannot just separate young and the old, what is the extent of reduction in mortality you can still achieve? And that is where we have to aim at, because we don't have drugs for this.
Well,
So there's no alternative.
you said it very aptly. You said we don't have an alternative. The herd immunity, as you said in part one, is the only lasting solution. Now, as you said in part two, we don't have an alternative. We cannot remain in lockdown for a year or two till a vaccine is developed. That would cripple our economy, and hunger and destitution would kill our people. We don't have an alternative. One more question about herd immunity. Many people say it's a form of social Darwinism. The fit will survive, the vulnerable won't. How do you respond to that interpretation or characterization?
Well, I understand sociology and I understand Darwinism. And the social Darwinism is a little tricky. If you mean that the rich can protect the elderly and the poor can't, you are right. But that is the saga that has been enacted again and again all over the world. I have no solution for that.
And that is the truth of India. The rich can protect themselves no matter what their age, the poor can't. And that is not to do with coronavirus. That is to do with the social economic reality of India that cuts through everything. Two questions before I end. Many people fear that there could be a second wave after the first abates. That's what happened, as you know, with the 1918 grand Spanish flu pandemic. It happened 4 or 5 months later. Will herd immunity protect us from a second wave, or is that unlikely?
The very fact there is a second wave means the herd immunity, which is supposed to be 60%, has reduced, say, to 50%. There's no way a virus can come back when the herd immunity. Now, the 60% I'm talking about is a number for our conversation. I don't know, it could be 70, 75, I don't know. But 60 is the working one. So the moment it comes down, that virus will return. All other viruses do the same thing. Measles does, German measles does. So they know, for some reason, immunity is down and they come back. And this will happen for corona also. And if that happens, the good proportion of the population will still be protected from the earlier infection. They don't have to worry. We just have to hope that this gap will be at least 2 years for it to return, in which case we'll have a vaccine by then.
I have to point out at this stage that you're making the coronavirus not only into a terribly evil virus, but also a rather intelligent one that knows when our herd immunity levels have dipped, this is their opportunity to strike again. I know we're laughing, but that is the truth of not just the coronavirus, all viruses. They have this amazing ability to know when our immunity levels are down and it's time for them to attack. My last question, and in a sense I've hinted at it in part one, but I'm asking it upfront once again. What do you believe the 3-week lockdown that ends today has achieved? And what do you think the lockdown that now continues till the 3rd of May can achieve? A brief answer.
The lockdown did slow down the transmission of the virus. There's no doubt about it. To some extent, some states better, other states not so much. But there was slowing down. Number one. The second issue is that it created a huge awareness among people about this coronavirus. I mean, that is important because we can't fight it without the support of the millions and millions of Indians. They need to participate in the process. It is not a military action.
That is a very important answer, sir, that you've given me. The lockdown may not be, and as you said, is not a solution to coronavirus. It may give us in some states time, in others it may not. But it has made the people aware of coronavirus, the risk and the danger, in a way that no other action by the government could have done. And therefore, simply because it has educated and awoken the Indian people up to the enormity of coronavirus, just for that reason alone, the lockdown was worth it. Yes or no?
That's correct.
Dr. Muliyil, a pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much for explaining your views so fully, for taking us through what are otherwise difficult epidemiological concepts for laymen to understand. But you made it very easy for us to understand why a lockdown is not a solution, why it's more like hiding from the virus rather than confronting it. And more importantly, you helped us understand how herd immunity is the only alternative. There are risks inherent in it. There are sacrifices we're asking of our young. There are dangers that our elderly will be exposed to. But the alternative is to be under lockdown to the vaccine, and that's not an alternative at all. And therefore, it's important that people should understand herd immunity may sound horrible, but it is the only way towards a future free of this wretched virus. Thank you very much for speaking so fully to me.
You're welcome.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.